But Macmillan and others are correct about the Japanese charge. Attacking in pitch darkness, they burst out from where they'd been dug in. The unit they ran into wasn't the raiders, it was us. They moved along the beach, yelling and shooting, running into our battalion's Y and K companies, and through our own L company. It was mayhem first class, with bayoneting, screaming, shouting, and the constant crackle of small arms fire in that black night. My outfit was right in the middle of it all, bullets flying in every direction, men running every which way, all of us scared, confused, and firing blindly half the time. Long after it was over, I talked about that awful night with Curtis Speedy Spach, one of my old cobber friends who was in L Company's 3rd platoon. He told me, "I was sticking everybody who came running near me with my bayonet and just hoping for the best." After the Japanese nighttime breakout, they moved along the riverbank toward the beach and the sand spit at the mouth of the Matanikau. Art Boston recalls that one enemy soldier stumbled and fell across his feet. The combat was that close. Both the Japanese and our guys fired in the dark whenever they thought they saw movement. We couldn't see anything, but we could hear plenty, and we could practically smell and feel the movement all around us. I remained hunkered down until first light, when I could see what I was doing and know why I should do it. To sum the battle up, we stayed in our position, toughed it out, and held that position through the night and into the morning. The raiders appeared shortly after daybreak, moved through our lines, crossed the Matanikau River at the sandspit, and disappeared. As first light of day crept over the jungle floor, the after-battle scene looked like an artist's rendition of Dante's Inferno. There were bodies all over, ours and the Japanese, some on top of others, many of them dead, others wounded. Somehow I had survived it and remained standing. In the space of maybe 25 square yards around me, all was quiet, except for an occasional moan or a weak cry. "Water? Help me!" A Japanese officer lay on the ground, a bullet wound in his neck, gasping and asking in English, "Water, please!" One of our 2 doctors showed up and started working fast on a lad from either I or K Company. The kid had been slashed across the stomach with a cutlass or sword, and for most of the night his intestines had been laying beside him in the mucky black sand. From somewhere, the doc had managed to get hold of a dirty white undershirt, which he put over the kid's chest. The doc had 2 corpsmen running back and forth, to and from the river, filling helmets with water, which he used to rinse the coils of the kid's guts before placing them on top of the skivvy shirt that was on the kid's chest and protecting them from the sand. The kid lay there in shock, chewing on a piece of wood to keep himself from screaming, as the doctor had no anaesthetic. The kid just bit down hard, gnashing his teeth on the wood. I don't know whether he survived, but if he did, he didn't have his own teeth any longer. Several weeks later, during our battle at Point Cruz, the same doctor who was now trying to save the life of the disemboweled kid was himself killed in action while working to save the life of another badly wounded warrior. But now I looked over the battlefield and waited for word, any word, from a superior officer to tell us what to do next. You knew there were bodies piled up in the brush. Where you could, you dragged them out carefully. They weren't just bodies, they were the guys you lived with. You shared booze with these guys, shared women, and bingo! They were gone. You tried to forget it, wipe it out. I don't know if you ever can. You subconsciously expected it to happen, expected buddies to get killed, but you couldn't go berserk over it. Sometimes you counted noses. Or you went around and looked for someone, hoping he was wounded but still alive. "Where the hell is so-and-so?" you asked a buddy. That's what my platoon assistant, Larry Hardrock Gherkin, must have been feeling when he eased up to where I was standing and told me he wanted to go over to the area where L Company's 2nd platoon was situated. He told me he wanted to check on the kid. The kid in this case was PFC Luther L. Rhodes, a very young lad who had joined L Company directly from boot camp just before we'd left New River, North Carolina. Back then, just about everybody in the Corps got a nickname, whether they asked for one or not, and this kid, having the name Rhodes, naturally got the nickname Dusty. When the war started, he'd probably lied about his age and claimed to be 18 to get the Marines to accept him. In those days, and with a war going on, The recruiting offices were less fussy about birth certificates than they are today. To look at Dusty Rhodes, you'd probably guess his age to be anywhere between 14 and 17, though most likely not more than 16. He had a big shock of very light blonde hair and a boyish face to go with it, and I don't think he was old enough to shave. In other words, he really was what Gherkin called him, a kid. There were a few older wise guys in Rhodes's platoon who picked on him, mainly because he was so young, what they called a chicken. But he was a spunky kid and would flare up at his antagonizers, often going at them with fists flying. We older guys, I was all of 21, didn't take the situation seriously at first, but after a while the bullying started to bother us. That's when my good buddy Larry Gherkin decided enough was enough. One day several young blowhards had ganged up and were giving Dusty a hard time. I noticed that the kid was sobbing, but his fists were flying. Larry noticed it too, and decided on the spot that we'd all seen and heard enough. Larry Gherkin was about 5'10", not unusually tall, but he was husky, tough, and very strong. I'd once seen him pick up a 6-footer and throw him through the air. Larry had small hands that made small fists, but they were hard fists that could knock you cold. Under all but the most extreme circumstances, he was a very gentle man, but rile him and you'd be facing a bulldog. When the occasion called for it, he was also as quick as a ferret. Now he jumped into the centre of the brawl, and within a second or two, several of the bullies suddenly went flying without wings. Rhodes was on the ground, but Larry had one foot on his chest to hold him down and keep him out of further trouble. Gherk wasn't even breathing hard. "I've watched you one-balled fools pick on this kid since he came aboard," Gherk said to the guys he'd just picked up and thrown. His foot was still on the kid's chest. "You've made him into a good fighter, but I'm telling you here and now that the next son of a bitch who gives this kid a hard time is going to irritate me. And if you irritate me, I promise to bust your fucking head wide open so everybody can see the shit that's in your skull instead of brains." They knew that from then on, anybody who fucked with that kid was fucking with Gherkin. "Pass the word," he told his battered antagonists. They knew that when he said, "Don't fuck with this kid anymore," they had damn well better listen to him. From then on, Dusty Rhodes would go to Gherkin the way a kid will usually go to his father or a big brother. Maybe he'd have a problem, and Gherk would hear him out, give him some advice, and say, "Okay, son." He always called the kid son. "You'll be all right." Gherk thought very highly of that kid. But on this day on Guadalcanal, Gherkin and I stood in the middle of a battlefield, the battle now ended, but the blood, death, moans, dismembered bodies, and general ugliness were all around us. No sooner had Gherkin told me that he wanted to check on the kid when I saw Dusty Rhodes's corporal and squad leader coming toward us. He spoke to Gherk. "Larry, I've been looking for you." "Oh?" Gherk said. "How's the kid?" "That's why I came over here, Gherk," the corporal said. "I wanted you to know the kid got hit last night." "How bad?" Gherkin asked. "Will he be okay?" "Look, Larry," the corporal said. "It was dark, all hell was busting loose, and I don't know what the hell happened." He stopped talking for a second, then said, "He's dead, Larry, and I just wanted to tell you personally." Gherkin didn't say anything. He lowered his head and kicked at the dirt a couple of times. He didn't say anything at all, and I didn't say anything either. There was nothing I could tell him. The only decent thing I could do was to keep quiet and leave Gherk alone. Finally, Gherk looked up again and asked the corporal, "Where is he? Where's the kid?" "He's over here a little way," the corporal said. Gherkin looked at me. "I'm going to go take a look at him, or—" "Okay, Larry," I said. "Go ahead. No, wait. I'll go with you." So we followed the corporal over to where his squad was situated, and as we got there, we saw the kid's body. Gherkin choked up and let out a sob. There in front of us, in the midst of all the dead and wounded, 2 men from the 2nd platoon were rolling Dusty onto a poncho. My thought then, and my vivid memory today, 60 years later, was how white Dusty's light blonde hair looked as they wrapped him in the poncho. Gherkin pulled himself together and went directly to the 2 men who were getting ready to take the kid's body away. He said to them, Don't drop that kid while you're moving him in that poncho. Don't bump him on the ground, or I'll kick the shit out of both of you." "Okay, Girk," one of them said quietly. "Don't worry, we'll take good care of him." Larry wandered off somewhere, and it was about 30 minutes before he showed up again. I never heard him mention the kid again, or say anything about him. Not ever. I understood his silence perfectly. It was the only way you could keep on going and keep yourself from cracking up altogether. Death was everywhere, but to keep going we had to push the dead out of our thoughts. And from that day on, I never heard anyone mention Dusty Rhodes's name in Larry Gherkin's presence. Today I allow myself to think of that kid, and I think also of several others I knew who didn't make it off the canal, or off several other Pacific islands. It still hurts, thinking about them. By now they should be old men like me. Old men who have lived long, eventful lives. But they didn't make it past their boyhood. Soon after Gherkin came back from wherever he had wandered, I got word to prepare for moving the platoon out of the area. A little earlier, before I received that order to move out, a jeep appeared, coming toward us on the Coppercart Road from the direction of our MLR. It turned out to be General Vandergrift. It so happened that the General's driver was an old friend of mine from before the war, dating back to the time when we were stationed together at Guantanamo. I caught sight of him at the wheel, and I went over to talk with him and exchange scuttlebutt. That's how I happened to get a ringside seat for what occurred next. It turned out that Vandergrift was trying to make contact with Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, whose battalion of the 7th Marine Regiment was situated well across the Matanikau. The General had a radio and radio man with him in his jeep. At the same time, one of our Higgins boats was located out on the bay, a few hundred yards from the mouth of the Matanikau, and just beyond rifle range from shore. The Higgins boat also had a radio, which now served General Vandergrift as his relay. At that time, radios were few and far between on the island, and the radios we did possess didn't have much range. Using the Higgins boat's radio as a relay, the General managed to make contact with Puller's unit. The message coming our way from somewhere across the river and from out of the jungle highlands between Point Cruz and Kokumbona was from Puller, who insisted that he had the Japanese on the run. I don't know, maybe he did have them running, but Vandergrift now wanted Puller to move back. The General had just received word that a very large Japanese task force had left Rabaul, and that it was loaded with troops and headed our way. Vandergrift wanted every Marine hunkered down inside our MLR to man our beach defences in preparation for a direct seaborne invasion. It turned out that such an attack was not part of the Japanese plan, but at that time, and from where we were situated, it remained a very likely possibility. Vandergrift was making the sensible decision to defend against such an invasion. But from where I happened to be standing as a witness, it was clear that the General was having trouble getting his message through to Puller. Vandergrift's radio man kept repeating the General's message. "Break off from battle and head back to the MLR immediately." That order didn't get a reply, and the General had his radio man continue to repeat it. "Break off from battle and head back to the MLR immediately." Still no answer, and I could see that the General was getting pissed off. We knew well enough that Puller was getting the message, but it wasn't a message he wanted to hear. He was pretending it wasn't coming through, and the General was getting more and more impatient. After a couple more tries, Vandergrift said to his radio man, "Tell him that's a direct order." That message did get a response. We all heard Puller get on the radio from his end, and I recognized Puller's voice myself. "Who's giving me this order?" That's when the General really got pissed. There went his helmet, bouncing on the ground, the same way we'd seen him throw it on the day the B-17s dropped their bombs into the ocean, instead of on the Japanese transport ship. "God damn it!" Vandergrift shouted into the radio. "Lewis, this is Archer. Get back here now. I'm giving the goddamned order. I want to see your men down on the beach and running in this direction. Have them coming this way and do it fast." Within less than 15 minutes we could see Puller's battalion down on the beach and moving our way, exactly as the General had ordered them to move, fast. I believe that incident cooked Puller's goose with Vandergrift and other senior officers on the canal for the rest of the campaign. Puller redeemed himself later, but after that day it appeared that he was not one of Vandergrift's favourite officers. Less than a week later, on October 13th, our 3rd Battalion was back in the vicinity of the Matanikau River. The Japanese transports had arrived from Rabaul, as Vandergrift had been warned, but the enemy had made their landings well away from our MLR, at staging areas where they were preparing for new land-based assaults. With the threat of a direct Japanese assault on our beach now greatly reduced, L Company moved westward from our MLR once more. We crossed the Matanikau, but this time nearly a mile upriver, on a crude makeshift bridge known as One Log Bridge. We'd been in the thick of a pitched battle the night before, and by this time my platoon consisted of no more than about 10 physically beaten warriors. As the unit's only currently active sergeant, and with no officer with us, once again I was effectively the platoon leader. We were tired, and most of us were sick from one or another of the things that were common on the canal. Malaria, jungle rot, bad food, practically no food, you name it. After we'd crossed the Matanikau, we made a left turn, an inland turn, and moved up a hillside to relieve a company that was partially dug in on a ridge. From this position we could see Point Cruz sticking out into the sea directly below us. It was late afternoon by the time we made it to the top of the hill. I don't know why, but it always seemed to happen that way. Our timing was such that relieving another unit always seemed to occur in late afternoon, which never gave us time to check our surroundings adequately or dig in better before dark set in. We dug in at our ridge positions just before dark, and that night my platoon had an encounter with, of all things, dogs. We'd relieved a platoon from the 7th Regiment. They were damned eager to get off that ridge. As they were pulling out, one of their riflemen told us, "Those dirty fools had a couple of dogs sniffing around and yapping in front of our line last night. You'd better keep an ear open for them after it gets dark." That was odd. We'd never heard anything about dogs before. We went about our business, occupying positions, tying in with the platoons on our flanks, and getting ready for one more tropical nightfall, which we knew very well would come early and fast. We settled down without delay, each of us in 2-man positions, and everything fell quiet until a little after midnight. At about that time we heard movement coming from the bottom of the hill. It had to be the Japanese. They probably were trying to be quiet, but in that undergrowth each step sounded like an elephant doing push-ups. We heard them coming closer. Occasionally we could make out a word or two, softly spoken in Japanese. Then, for the first time, we heard a couple of soft yips and yaps and whines. Throughout the entire Guadalcanal campaign, we never had the luxury of being able to spray the countryside with ammunition every time we heard a suspicious noise or movement. Our supplies were always critically short. Every round of ammo was valuable. Beyond the supply problem, fire discipline had been pounded into our heads through all our training. Whenever you fire a weapon at night, you immediately give away your position, which dramatically increases the odds of your next of kin getting an unwelcome telegram. We were all dumbfounded by the yips and whines. There was no doubt it was dogs. We hadn't heard the sound of barking dogs since New Zealand. It was a familiar and friendly sound, but in the middle of a jungle combat area, it became something else, a weird experience that raised our hackles. Maybe half an hour passed, and gradually the sounds and movements came closer. Footsteps in the jungle undergrowth, whispers, the whine of a dog. A quarter moon came out, which gave us just a sliver of light. It wasn't much light, but it was enough for us to make out shadowy figures moving in on us. Now was our moment to act. We threw 2 hand grenades from our position, then a third. We followed up those 3 explosions with a brief crackle of gunfire. We each fired 3 or 4 rounds, but no more than that. Yells came from the Japanese, a few more yips and yaps from the dogs, and that was it. We signalled among ourselves, and everyone in the platoon checked in okay. No casualties. There was nothing more for us to do except wait. There were no more sounds of movement, no more whispers in Japanese, and no more sniffing or whining. Deathly quiet descended upon us for the rest of the night. With the first faint light of daybreak, we began to make out the terrain and see each other in our positions. With daylight, we received orders to reconnoitre a short distance down the hill and try to find out what the Japanese had been up to, if anything. We didn't have to go far. Immediately in front of our position, we found the bodies of about a half-dozen Japanese and 2 small dogs that looked like a pair of beagles. They weren't more than puppies. As soon as we got back to our positions, orders came for us to saddle up, move out, and cross back over the river. Coast watchers had reported another Japanese convoy headed toward Guadalcanal. That was my only experience with Japanese war dogs. Maybe they weren't war dogs after all, but just some Japanese soldiers' pets brought to the canal from another island. There were also rumours, which proved to be true, that their food situation was even worse than our own. Maybe they were serving dogs at chow time. But as I looked at those dead puppies on that ridge, now hot with the morning sun and filled with the stench of decaying bodies, the sight of those dead puppies left me feeling sad. Enemy armies were fighting and killing each other, but these were only innocent puppies. With morning light and a lessening of immediate danger, my platoon's overriding need was for water. By now we didn't have a drop of water in any of our canteens, so I decided to take a few men, go down to the Matanikau, and fill our expeditionary cans with river water. We continued our practice of adding a few drops of iodine to each can. It didn't help the water's taste any, but it killed the dangerous bacteria. That's what we were told anyway. Quite a bit later that day, we got orders to recross the Matanikau and start moving back toward our MLR. With the rest of L Company, we retraced the route we'd come by, recrossing on one log bridge. Back across the river, we moved up to the summit of another small ridge, where our company was met by the battalion's exec officer, Major Robert O. Bowen. I was within earshot of the conversation he started having with our new CO, Captain John Smith, and I overheard a little of what they were talking about. I didn't like what I heard. It had something to do with barbed wire. Bowen was explaining to Smith that he wanted to set a trap for the Japanese on this side of the Matanikau. He planned to send back to the MLR for 1 or 2 rolls of barbed wire, which some of the men from our company would be detailed to string along this ridge as a tactic to waylay the advancing enemy. At best, I was only half listening, but the little that I gathered was not good news. Which lucky platoon was going to get stuck with this harebrained detail? "Hey, Marion, come on over here!" the CO called. Oh shit, I thought, as I went over to join them. "Did you hear what the Major was saying?" "No, sir." That wasn't what he wanted to hear, and he let me know it. Finally, Major Bowen explained his idea a second time for my benefit. I listened, but as he went on talking, I was thinking, he believes the Japanese are going to be stupid. He thinks they'll fall for a dumb trap that won't slow them down for 5 seconds. I didn't say anything right away. I listened as the Major continued to make his point. The Japanese will get to the wire, and it'll slow them down. That's when your platoon holds them off. You'll fire on them and slow down their movement. Oh, sure, I thought. It was starting to get late in the day, which meant that my men would be doing this lousy job in the pitch dark. Worse yet was the fact that they'd be working in a totally unfamiliar area. But I listened and didn't argue. Instead, I waited until the Major was finished. Then I asked a few simple questions. "How much longer will it be before the barbed wire arrives?" "Well," he hesitated, "I'm sure we'll get it up here soon." "Wonderful." "Sir," I said, "pretty soon it's going to be dark. We'll have to work in the dark. It's impossible to string barbed wire effectively when you can't see where you're going or what you're doing." He didn't have an answer for that. "What's more, we can't string wire without stakes. Are we getting stakes with the wire?" "Well, no. You'll have to chop some wood if you need stakes." "Just a minute, sir. What do we use to chop wood? How do we make these stakes? We haven't got any tools." He didn't have an answer for that either. "Here's something else," I said. "It's hard enough stringing barbed wire in broad daylight with our bare hands. Do we get gloves so we can handle the wire?" "No, we don't have gloves. We're lucky to have the barbed wire." Maybe he was lucky to have the wire. I didn't feel very lucky. I was asking questions he couldn't answer, and he was getting exasperated with me. I didn't give a damn. My questions were making sense, and his answers weren't. It was just about then that a runner came into sight and approached us. As usual, radios weren't available to us, and runners were our only way to communicate. "Major, hold everything," the runner called as he reached us. "I've got a message for you." The Major took the message, and I watched silently while he opened it and read it. Finally, he looked at me. "Okay, disregard everything I said. Let's move. We're all going back to the perimeter right now." I was saved. My platoon was saved. They'd have hung us out to dry, and we'd never have made it back. Instead, we now did what the Major said, which was to move out right away. It grew dark while we were still moving back to our line. By the time we reached our MLR, we were moving in the dark. If it hadn't been for that runner and his message, my platoon would have been trying to string barbed wire in that same pitch blackness. We'd have been in a hopeless fix. I'd been on the canal for a little more than 2 months, and by now I'd gradually come to understand that my platoon and I were on our own. Lieutenant Flaherty, our platoon leader, and several of our NCOs were back in the field hospital. They were down with malaria, and all that remained of the platoon were me and what was left of my men. By mid-October 1942, I'd seen enough combat to know that the first thing I had to do was look after myself and my men. A few of my superior officers didn't always seem to share my attitude. Everyone who was on the canal during the big combined Japanese air raid, land artillery and naval bombardment in mid-October will always remember it. For 2 straight days there was always a shell or a bomb falling into our narrow boundary perimeter. It was a situation that prompted the frustrating kind of anger that comes to men who are taking punishment but can't retaliate. The Japanese were getting ready for another big attack on the marine perimeter, but the news story that my folks back home read in the Buffalo Evening News on October 10th accentuated the positive, as one popular song from the 1940s put it. You had to read past the headlines to realize that the going was tough for us guys in the foxholes. After the Guadalcanal campaign was over, each of us would tell his own story of weird things that had happened to him or his buddies during those seemingly endless hours of bombardment. The yarns range from bouts of dysentery between shell and bomb bursts to fighting the grey rats that didn't like what was happening above ground any more than we did and insisted on trying to share our spider holes with us. We hated those grey critters nearly as much as we hated the Japanese who were trying to kill us. If anything strange was going to occur in L-35's 1st Platoon, it was probably going to happen to Larry Hardrock Gherkin, barman extraordinary. Gherkin was not a foul-up or a cork-off. On the contrary, he was one Marine who was on the ball, conscientious, always ready to help a buddy, and honest as the day is long. And even though he had the strength to throw a 6-foot man 6 feet across the ground, his nature was gentle, kind, and caring. Hardrock didn't have an enemy in the world that I ever heard of, but that didn't prevent crazy things from happening to him on a regular basis. Such occurrences would leave him shaking his head and saying the nearest thing to a curse word that was part of his regular vocabulary, "Jeez!" On the first night of that huge Japanese naval bombardment, our 1st Platoon was one of 2 platoons of L Company that was pulled away from positions outside the perimeter and moved to beach defense along the berm line. The new fighter strip No. 2 was located behind us. We'd been bombed from the air and shelled by field artillery throughout the day, and as it began to grow dark, we looked out to sea and saw the Japanese fleet moving in. Now it was their turn to try to finish us off. Their destroyers moved close in, formed a line, and started a barrage that has been written about many times and by many Marines who survived that awful night. It might seem odd to anybody who has never been in combat, but shelling, bombing, and high-angle fire in general don't shake up experienced riflemen too badly if they've had time to dig in properly. And we were well dug in. We were shaken, rattled, and rolled, and it's possible that a Marine hasn't really lived until he experiences those big shells coming through, zipping close overhead or skidding along the ground and sounding like runaway boxcars. For all the fireworks that took place on that long night, L Company suffered no serious casualties. With the morning's first light, I climbed out of my spider hole and took a look around, just to make sure the world was still there, still round, and still in orbit. The area was a complete mess. Very few guys were up and around yet. One or two cobbers poked their heads up out of their holes like ground squirrels. I could see the glazed look in their eyes, punch-drunk and sleepy. Dud shells littered the area. The Japanese Navy had been shooting at us with high-explosive and armour-piercing rounds that hadn't hit anything solid enough to set them off. So there they lay among our spider holes, as though daring us to bang one of them on its nose and fly directly off to hell in the explosion that would follow. Being out of my spider hole, I was one of the first to notice two unfamiliar Marines walking through our area and looking at the duds. The visitors turned out to be our ordnance people. I decided that I'd better check heads and count butts, just to make sure that all my men were still among the living. "Poke your heads up and let me see your beautiful eager pussies," I shouted. One by one, heads began popping up. Everyone was accounted for, except for one man, PFC, Larry Hard Rock Gherkin. I looked around, trying to recall the exact location of Girk's spider hole, and as my eyes found the spot where I expected him to be, the truth hit me. "Holy keyreast!" I yelled. A huge Japanese naval shell was plugging the top of Larry Gherkin's hole. I ran straight to the spider hole, and a couple of the guys came with me. "Girk, are you okay? Can you hear me down there?" His voice came back, muffled but clear enough. "Stop asking questions and get this goddamn thing off me." This had to be really serious. Girk was actually cursing, and for good reason. The damned shell had ploughed a 20-foot-long furrow along the ground and stopped directly above Hard Rock's head. The two ordnance men were close by. I gave out a yell, and they came running toward us. It turned out to be a simple matter for them to lash a line around the shell. Carefully we helped them pull, and pretty soon the top of Gherkin's spider hole came into view. Next came Gherkin's head. Almost casually he emerged from his hole. "Geez," he said. "I was starting to get a little nervous down there. What took you guys so long?" I noticed one of his hands. "Girk, what happened to your hand?" It turned out that during the night, when the earth shook extra hard and the dark sky over Gherkin's spider hole deepened to pitch blackness, he had reached up with his left hand to try to feel what had happened up there. What was worse, his hole suddenly grew hot as hell. He put the palm of his left hand on that heat-radiating projectile, burned himself, then sat down at the bottom of his hole, where he waited out the night and hoped nothing would hit that monster that had just become his roof. If what happened to Hard Rock Gherkin back then happened to a military man of today, our modern warrior would receive at least one Purple Heart medal, a couple of weeks of R&R, a promotion of at least 2 stripes, and maybe even a court-martial for impersonating an officer. But on the canal back in 1942, a corpsman spread a little greasy salve on Girk's burn and covered it with a skimpy piece of gauze. An hour later, our platoon headed back out to the jungle side of our perimeter, and the only thing that Hard Rock got was his butt chewed out because his bar was full of sand. By mid-October, the Guadalcanal campaign was finally being recognized by the press reporting to the home front as a major engagement. Battle reports from the canal were making the papers on a daily basis. That story was accurate. The Japanese were preparing for what turned out to be their final major assault on Henderson Field. One miserable October day in the middle of the Guadalcanal campaign, I saw a mystery airplane. Before anybody starts thinking I was hallucinating after too many run-ins with the enemy, I'd better add that plenty of others saw that mystery plane too. One thing about it was not at all mysterious. It had a shiny red meatball on each wing, which made it not only a mystery plane, but an unfriendly mystery. At that point in the campaign, Company L35 was taking a lot of shit from every direction on the compass. I was a buck sergeant in one of 2 platoons that had been moved up to ridge positions just off the main perimeter. By this time, even the dumbest Marine on the island had figured out that Henderson Field was what the entire Guadalcanal campaign was all about. I don't guess we knew yet what we were supposed to be doing there, except that we couldn't get off the damned island. While the Japanese army continued giving us a rough time on the ground, Japanese airplanes and ships at sea were attacking the airfield and us regularly, and in large numbers. Luckily, Marine fighter pilots manning Grumman Wildcats were downing Japanese planes in large numbers, with much-needed help from our land-based anti-aircraft gunners. The night before the mystery plane incident was a typical bad night for us. Before the moon came up, we were shelled from the sea. Then Washing Machine Charlie, the two-engine Japanese bomber with engines that sounded like an old washing machine motor, came over and paid his nightly visit. He'd rumble overhead and drop a couple bombs into our area, hoping for a lucky hit. Sometimes the fool got one, though that night all he did was make us duck into our spider holes and pray, while a couple of thuds shook the ground. After Charlie went away, Pistol Pete or his Japanese kid brother sent in a few rounds, just to keep us troops honest and on our toes. Pistol Pete was our nickname for a Japanese land artillery piece that shelled us with regularity. At the crack of dawn, we looked out to sea from our high point on the ridge. Off to the west toward Point Cruz, we could make out a couple of good-sized Japanese ships that were feverishly unloading troops. There wasn't a damn thing we could do about it, so we ignored it, as though nothing were happening out there. By that time on the canal, you had to be good at ignoring the unpleasant things you couldn't do anything about. If you didn't ignore them, you'd soon be looking around the bend for the streetcar that was going to come and take you home. For us, Snuffies, staying alive had become the point of every battle, more so because we knew we had been abandoned. For the time being, all was quiet on our ridge, which gave us a few minutes to tell each other that we wished we were back stateside. If that was asking too much, then we wished we could at least get a cup of good hot coffee. That was asking for too much, too. Our talk was interrupted when 6 Zeros appeared from out of nowhere. They were coming in our direction. Like most high points on the canal's terrain, the covering growth on our ridge was too sparse to give us hiding places. That left us visible and in constant danger from the air. The Zeros were going to take advantage of that situation right now. They'd spotted us and were zooming in directly at us. We moved fast to save our lives, scrambling to the opposite side of the ridge from where the Zeros were approaching. They strafed, but by the time their bullets came whistling in, we'd taken cover on the ridge's safe side. They roared overhead in a flash and kept going into the distance behind us. We turned our heads and watched them, hoping they'd disappear forever. Not a chance. Our position on the ridge was too tempting. They wheeled around and came at us again, which forced us to hurry back over to the ridge's opposite side, then hug the dirt while more of their machine gun bullets peppered the ridge. They put us through that ordeal 3 more times. We didn't take any casualties, but all the time we were running from one side of the ridge to the other, we were scared and were bitching, cursing, shouting at each other, and yelling at the sky. "Why the hell are you picking on us? Go down to Kukum and strafe some shore party guys. Go strafe the airport like you sons of bitches usually do. For Christ's sake, give us a break." Not that they heard us, or gave a damn, but the Zeros finally gave up and disappeared. Safe for the moment, we looked down at the fighter airstrip and saw one of our own planes taking off. The first thing I thought was, "You're a little late, goddammit." One of the other guys said out loud what I was thinking. "Where the hell were you when the goddamn Zeros were coming at us?" he yelled. But even if our pilot could have heard us, he had something different in mind. We watched him scooting no higher than treetop level and then heading out to sea toward those Japanese ships that were still being unloaded. Our pilot flew his plane straight over one of the ships and then dropped a single bomb directly down and into its hold. Boom. That, anyhow, made a few less enemy troops that we'd have to deal with. While we watched, he turned his plane around on a dime and headed back toward the airfield. He'd made it about halfway home when those 6 Zeros decided to come back, but this time they were leaving us alone. They had spotted our plane and were heading straight for it. It began to look as though every one of those Zeros was fighting each other, trying to get the first crack at our plane. Our pilot was flying low, in a vulnerable position and badly outnumbered. He did the only thing he could do. He began taking evasive action, and we lost sight of him as he manoeuvred still lower, flying and banking among Guadalcanal's tall palm trees. All he could hope to do was get back to the airstrip and put the plane on the ground without getting himself killed. We learned later that he made it. I heard that he was out of the plane even before it came to a complete stop, and that he ran like hell while the Zeros dove in on him, strafing the ground around him and pockmarking his plane with holes. But by the time he was on the field, we had something entirely different to grab our attention: the mystery plane. One of our guys let out a yell. I looked his way and saw him pointing toward an approaching, low-flying airplane of a type we hadn't seen before. It was coming toward us from over the Matanikau Point cruise area, which meant that it had to be a Japanese, probably flying in from Rabaul. As it got closer, I made out its details. It was a slow-flying, twin-engine, non-combat plane with a big, shiny red meatball on each wing, and its winner of a pilot was now bringing it in at treetop level with its wheels down, showing every sign that he was coming in for a landing. "Landing on our airfield! What's that crazy fool doing?" one of our guys yelled. "Holy shit! He's coming in for a landing!" By now we were all heads up, wide-eyed and watching. Not one of us could believe what our eyes were showing us. Weeks in combat had made a few of the guys so blasé that they hadn't even bothered watching when our pilot damn near wrapped himself around jungle coconut palms to evade the Zeros. But now even those nonchalant warriors were watching the mysterious Japanese plane, their mouths wide open like the rest of us. It was one more example of an old combat soldier's saying, "If something weird hasn't happened yet, just wait a minute, and it will." Soon the mystery plane was broadside to us, and we could see 4 windows on our side of its fuselage, with faces looking out through those windows, at us. Those faces belonged to Japanese officers wearing white uniforms, and the fact that we could make out that much detail tells you how close the plane was to our ridge. It couldn't have been much more than 75 feet from our position, floating in at about the same elevation as our ridgetop. No one gave a signal or said a word, but nobody had to. The meatballs decorating that plane said it all for us. Every one of us started firing, using every weapon we had: Springfield 03s, bars, Tommy guns, machine guns, even 45 automatics. For maybe 10 or 15 seconds we fired and kept on firing with everything we had. I got off only about 3 shots, and I don't know if any of mine hit the plane, but it was so close that they might have. From positions below the ridge and from several different directions, other Marines were also firing on that misguided champion of a pilot. The plane was flying so low and so slow that we couldn't have missed it with a rock. At least 100 tracers, along with rounds from all kinds of weapons, went through that fuselage. The plane took a sudden, sharp dip below ridge level and sank into the treetops, out of sight and into jungle growth. The next thing we saw was the explosion, and some of the 1,000 flying pieces that recently had been the mystery plane. My guess is that somebody back at their headquarters had given these Japanese a bum scoop, leading them to believe that the airfield was captured and they could land safely. It had to be something like that, because this clearly wasn't a combat plane, and it wasn't a reconnaissance plane either. We could plainly see that it was a slow 2-engine passenger plane filled with officers in their white uniforms. Before an hour had passed, all excitement and talk about the mysterious Japanese airplane was ended. We had more immediate things to worry about, which included staying alive. We spent several more days patrolling from that ridge, or gathering and reporting information when our position from that high vantage point enabled us to spot enemy activity. Then we were sent down to a new position in the coconut groves, where we prepared for a new offensive operation that would send us back to the Matanikau River. The airplane incident was just something odd that had happened. Then we went back to coping with more basic things: staying alive, getting enough food and water to keep going, getting ammunition so we could keep fighting. But to my knowledge, mystery has always surrounded that incident, and 60 years later, I still wonder about it. I've compared notes with a few other Marines, but we never came up with anything more than speculation. Marines from companies other than L35 helped shoot the plane down, and some of them might have examined the wreckage, or maybe they saw something that day that we didn't see. Whatever the real story turns out to be, 2 platoons from Company L35 once helped shoot down an enemy plane. That isn't a claim many infantrymen can make. It had been way back in early August when the US Navy's defeat at the Battle of Savo Island sent Admiral Gormley scurrying for safety, pulling our fleet out of the area and leaving us Marines stranded. But it wasn't until the middle of October, when the tide of battle was clearly turning in our favour, that the Savo Island engagement and its losses were made known to the folks back home. It should go without saying that the good news in these headlines was vastly exaggerated and American losses minimised. Anyway, the US Navy had finally gotten around to admitting a defeat. I don't know anybody in our unit who was keeping track of dates, but the history books say it was at about dusk on October 23rd, when the Japanese sent 10 light tanks across the narrow mouth of the Matanikau River. We couldn't know it at the time, but it turned out to be a part of the last effective Japanese thrust toward Henderson Field. The first tank was knocked out as it tried to cross the sand spit at the shore, and then the tanks behind it were destroyed one by one. My platoon was a short way upriver during that shootout. Ernie Snowden saw them. We weren't far up from the river's mouth when the Japanese tanks tried to cross. I remember our half-track dug in on our side of the river, dug in like it was on a ramp, with just the barrel of its 75mm gun sticking out above ground. That was the time when Lieutenant Thomas O'Neill and I were pinned down by Japanese machine gun fire. It was cutting the weeds right over our heads. I told the lieutenant that when the Japanese fire let up, I was getting out of there. He said no, but I waited for my chance and got out of there anyway. I made it behind a big tree where it was safer, and that's where I found the rest of the men in my squad. Curtis Speedy Spach was in L Company's 3rd platoon, and even closer to the tank action during that battle. I didn't know the Japanese had any tanks with them, because up to then I hadn't seen one. But the damn tanks were there that evening. I heard something roaring, and I thought it was low-flying Japanese planes. Then here came those Japanese tanks right at us. Our half-track was dug in, and its gun knocked the tanks out. When the Japanese opened the tanks' hatches to crawl out, we cleaned them up. Sergeant Anderson and his crew from our 5th Regiment's 37mm guns had one of his guns dug in on the Matanikau line. That gun, plus the half-track, which had a 75mm gun, combined to knock out most of the tanks before they could start to cross the river and reach our positions. I believe only one Japanese tank made it as far as the sandbar, which was partway across the river. At that time it came under heavy small arms fire from several of our units. Then a Marine from a neighbouring unit disabled that lead tank by jamming a tree limb into one of its tracks. The tanks behind it were stranded, and their crews were all killed. A week or two later, we returned for what turned out to be one final time to that sand spit at the mouth of the Matanikau. We were on our way to what would become the Point Cruz battle. The disabled tanks were still there at the sand spit. My thoughts, as I saw those tanks for a second time, were, why didn't one of our units blow the damned things up and get them the hell out of there? Each one of those tanks would have been an ideal hiding place for a sniper, had the Japanese thought to take advantage of them. It was the same kind of question I'd asked myself about that big copra hut we'd encountered on Beach Red when we'd first landed on the canal 3 months earlier. That had been another ideal place for snipers. Why hadn't our naval artillery knocked that hut flat before we landed on the beach? We'd been lucky on D-Day, and we would be lucky a second time in early November when we crossed the Matanikau on our way to Point Cruz. But you'd like to hope that somebody in command might be thinking of the ordinary gravel cruncher's welfare, rather than just relying on luck. The last time I saw the little village of Matanikau would be just about the last time anyone in the world would ever see it, because it isn't there anymore. Point Cruz, a neighbouring piece of rocky land, still juts into the ocean, but the spot where a tiny cluster of native huts was once the village of Matanikau is now part of Honiara, a city with a population of somewhere around 44,000. Today, Honiara serves as the Solomon Islands government capital. The entire region around the Matanikau River had been the scene of several battles, and it had become known as one of the bloodiest combat zones of the Guadalcanal campaign. Because L Company was the farthest west unit positioned on the Marines' defence line, our squads had to take regular turns patrolling the abandoned cluster of huts where the village once stood. We called it a village but Matanikau wasn't more than 8 or a dozen native huts, each with a thatched roof and walls of palm fronds and palm branches woven together. The sides of each hut were open to the air, and the huts were clustered together no more than an easy stone's throw apart. This cluster of huts sat on the landward side of a little dirt road no wider than a good-sized kitchen table. Beyond the huts was nothing, just thick jungle growth covering rising terrain. By the time we first entered the village, the natives had abandoned it and were living up in the hills, away from the combat zone. We'd seen a few of the natives' bodies that first time, but historians who wrote about piles of bodies at Matanikau got it wrong. The village is right down at sea level, where the natives could fish for subsistence. It's hot and damp. A body lying on the ground there first bloats up and then bursts out of its clothes within 24 hours. Give it another 48 hours, and there's very little left. Bodies usually don't pile up in a tropical environment. It wasn't long before we torched those huts, so we'd never have to concern ourselves with the enemy hiding in them and waiting for us in ambush. So by November, between the trucks, the tanks, and the artillery fire that had crunched over the area, there was no longer a village of Matanikau, and there never would be again. It had been pulverized. Today, from the very spot we were standing that November, you can book an excursion cruise, including some scuba diving, out to what Honiara's website describes as some important World War II sites. Honiara brags about its nice cafes, restaurants and bars, and even sports the 3-star Iron Bottom Sound Hotel, where you can get a room for under $75 a night. Old ex-Marines like me think back to that desolate spot of nothing that soaked up our buddies' blood, and we can only say, "Can you believe that one?" Some guys went back later as tourists, but I never wanted to go back. I didn't leave anything on that island worth going back for except my youth and one hell of a lot of my good friends. And I can't recover either of them. Well, nobody was thinking about tourism during the first week of November 42. As a Marine in L Company's 3rd Battalion, 5th Regiment, I played a small part in what the official history books now call the Matanikau Point Cruise engagement. I recall crossing the makeshift pontoon bridge that had just been rigged across the Matanikau River by the 1st Engineers Battalion. That crossing was at the sand spit, where the river empties into the bay. The same spot where several Japanese light tanks had been put out of action and destroyed on our previous visit. We crossed the river within yards of those burnt-out, abandoned tanks. We were lucky one more time. There weren't any snipers hiding in those tanks. Across the river we passed the wreckage of Matanikau village. My depleted platoon moved forward along the beach against a background crackle of steady small arms fire and the thuds of explosions coming from several different directions. By now I was an ancient warrior, a buck sergeant in L Company, and because at the moment I was the 1st platoon's senior man present, I was also platoon leader by default. Following me were 11 seasoned Marines. I'd estimate their average age to be an elderly 19. Even readers who don't know much about how combat units are organized might be puzzled by the fact that our platoon had only 11 men, but the simple fact is that we had lost most of our regulars. Casualties from illness, wounds, and KIAs had whittled us down. I was one of the few NCOs in my unit who hadn't been knocked down by malaria. My luck ran out a few weeks after we were taken off the canal and were supposedly safe. I caught malaria in Camp Cable, informally known as Camp Swampy, outside the handsome city of Brisbane on Australia's east coast. As several of my old cobbers often remark to this day, there were more and bigger mosquitoes at Camp Cable than the ones we had to fight on the canal. But now we were moving toward Point Cruz, with gunfire and explosions all around us. The worst of it came from a short distance straight ahead, where the Japanese were retreating, but not without putting up a fierce struggle. At the start of the Point Cruz operation, L Company had been placed in a reserve position, right behind the attacking units, which in our sector were the 3rd Battalion's Y and K companies, plus the machine guns of M Company. These and other units had already engaged the Japanese in the flattened remains of Matanikau village, driving them out of there. Until late October, the Matanikau Point cruise area had been a major point for the Japanese to unload men, supplies, and equipment as they prepared for their unsuccessful try at taking Henderson Field back from us. But at this stage in the campaign, the Japanese' only movement was backward. The fighting moved forward along the coast on this early November day, my platoon advancing directly behind the worst of it. My band of 11 men would plug the line in one area, reinforce it in another, and then join with other units to take part in an assault at still another point. At one spot, the Japanese had 2 anti-aircraft guns that they had lowered until their barrels were horizontal. This enabled them to fire on a flat trajectory, the shells coming straight at us at a height of about 4 feet off the ground. It was diabolical and lethal. I saw what was left of one of our guys who'd caught a round in the chest from one of those guns. As we moved in on Point Cruz, I saw one of our battalion corpsmen, accompanied by our doctor who had tried to save the life of the disemboweled Marine on the morning following our early October battle at the Matanikau River. They were hurrying past us in the direction of Point Cruz to attend another seriously wounded man. Just a few minutes later, the corpsman met us again on his way back. This time he was alone. Not stopping, he breathlessly told us that the doctor had been killed before he could reach the wounded Marine. It couldn't have been more than a few minutes later when a very young warrior, really just a kid, came staggering and running past us from the same direction, holding his bloody left eyeball in his hand. We'd gone another few dozen yards forward when the battalion exec officer approached me. "Have your men fix bayonets and prepare to charge. I want your platoon to swing to the right and help I Company run those Japanese into the bay." A swing to the right would put us directly on Point Cruz. Fix bayonets is just about the most blood-chilling order that a combat infantryman ever gets. It took us kids forever to engage the bayonet-retaining lugs on the muzzles of our rifles. Our hands were shaky and jerking because we were trying to hold our nerves together. Then the order, "Do it," came down, and our world became total mayhem, shouts, screams, and small arms fire. At this point in movies and novels, you get detailed accounts of heroics, but my guess is that the guys writing the stories and directing the films have never been anywhere near hand-to-hand battle. I'm talking about combat filled with screams, blood, bullets, violence, and death. I'm talking about the sounds, the taste, and the stink of death. I was there, and like most others who have undergone that experience on hundreds of different battlefields, I didn't remember a hell of a lot when it was over. For the most part, I still don't recall very much, and I give thanks to the man up topside for blanking out my memory of events that are too horrible for any sane man to want to remember. What I do recall is that after a while, don't ask me how long, the worst was over and I was still among the living. My platoon, or what was left of it, had joined I Company. By that time we were at the tip of Point Cruz, which was nothing more than jungle scrub brush and rocks that jutted into the bay. At Point Cruz, Sergeant Diedrich from Company 135 and some of his men were at the shoreline, firing their rifles at random into the water. All I could see was small, dark-looking objects bobbing on the ocean's surface. Diedrich stopped firing and looked my way when I approached. "What the hell are you shooting at?" I asked him. "The fools are trying to swim back to Japan," he said. Those dark, bobbing objects were the heads of Japanese soldiers swimming away from Point Cruz to save their lives. I assume their intention was to swim back to shore somewhere to our west, where they might be able to find relative safety. The guys from my unit joined in, firing at the Japanese in the water. I don't know if any of them made it back to shore, but it's safe to say that none of them made it back to Tokyo. Anyway, we did what the exec officer had told us to do. We ran the Japanese into the bay. That wasn't the end of the day for my platoon. Nobody below regiment level had radios, so on this occasion official communication came from a runner. He told me that orders were to take my platoon to the rear, moving back across the Matanikau. We were being relieved. I got my men together and we moved back. A fresh unit, from the 2nd Regiment, I think, became our replacement as the assault's main thrust now moved west and beyond Point Cruz, pushing the Japanese back in the direction of Kokumbona. On our way to the rear, we had to cross a small creek with muddy banks that dropped 2 to 4 feet down to the water's edge. I was first to step down into the water, and I signalled my platoon to follow. The man directly behind me had been assigned to my platoon from another unit, which is why I can't recall his full name today. He was a kid from New Jersey with a genuine Jersey accent, and we'd nicknamed him Greek. He was carrying our light machine gun. He took a step off the steep bank and planted 1 foot down into the mud. Then he slipped, lost his balance, and fell on his arse with a splat. As he fell, the machine gun flew out of his hands, also into the mud. He sat in several inches of thick mud, looking completely helpless. It could have happened to anybody, me included, but I had to keep the platoon moving, so I let him have it. "Get up!" I shouted. "And get that machine gun out of that mud, or I'll wrap my rifle around your thick skull." He looked up at me and groaned, then said something I didn't catch. Maybe I wasn't intended to catch it. I yelled some more, and he still didn't get up out of the mud, but this time he yelled back. We were busy exchanging pleasantries, and none of us noticed that just beyond the creek, off to our left and nearly hidden from us behind tropical growth, a jeep had parked just off the side of the Copra Cart Road. Somebody near the jeep moved, which caught my attention. I looked up. Standing beside the jeep and watching us was a man every Marine on the canal recognized, General Alexander A. Vandergrift. Another tall, thin, high-ranking officer stood next to the general, but I didn't recognize him. A third man wearing U.S. Navy insignia sat in the jeep. They were all looking down at the creek bank, their interest caught by our accident. I was naturally astonished, and my reaction was automatic. "Hiya, AA!" I called. "Hiya, General Vandergrift!" But I still had to deal with Greek and his machine gun in the mud, so I turned back to him. He sat unmoving in the slime, and he looked sad. My motor mouth started operating in top form, and by now Greek had reached the limit of his endurance. He started yelling back. We yelled at each other for about a minute, spicing our conversation with church service language. The rest of the platoon started joining in. Then we all shut up when the tall officer standing next to General Vandergrift stepped forward, made his way down to the creek bank, took hold of our fallen warrior's arms and lifted him out of the muck. Then he reached into the wet mud, picked up the light machine gun and gave it to poor Greek. By now I saw the officer's insignia. This man, too, was a general. He took one long, mournful look at our mud-caked warrior, then looked back at General Vandergrift. Good Lord! This man is so exhausted he can hardly stand. General Vandergrift nodded. "My men have been through hell, General Patch." Holy Christ! General Vandergrift and General Patch. Major General Alexander Patch, as every World War II history book will tell you, was commander of the Army's Americal Division, the unit that relieved us Marines and mopped up all remaining Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal after we evacuated. But at that moment, I simply said the first thing that came into my dumb head. "Say thank you to the gentleman," I instructed my mud-laden warrior. "That's it! Just what I need to hear," Greek yelled back at me. "A guy with clean clothes lifts me out of the goddamn mud and tells me I look tired. Then a no-good sergeant tells me to say thank you." He looked straight at me as he yelled, and I felt sorry for him, but I couldn't show it. "This no-good sergeant's done his best to get me killed the past few days, and now I gotta say thank you to a guy in clean clothes. Look at my goddamn clothes." Greek had a wonderful Jersey accent. He was yelling louder than the sounds of the occasional small arms rounds that were still zinging and crackling not all that far away. I let him yell. Get it out of his system. The top brass let him yell too. Somebody told me later that the Navy man in the jeep was Admiral Halsey. Finally, we made it back to an assembly area, and a runner pointed out a location where I could have my men fall out and catch our breath. Our rest area put us on safer ground than we'd occupied for many hours past, but small arms fire continued to crackle around us. The safest place for any of us to be was close to the ground. "Your company's other platoons will be here shortly," the runner told me. He was right about that detail. Moments later, I caught sight of my old buddy Sergeant Walter Sinsek leading his platoon back toward our area. Walter was a well-built 6-footer, a guy you didn't want to cross, a fighting fool. He had been in the Marines for 4 years before World War II, had come back after Pearl Harbor as a corporal, and by the time we were on the canal, he was a sergeant. Nearly all of us had nicknames, many of them chosen to use during a firefight. Many of them included sounds that the Japanese had trouble imitating. Walter's happened to be Chum. Don't ask why. Somehow the name Chum had been given to him, and it had stuck. Walter had a big, deep, resonant voice and a slow way of talking that always broke me up, even on a terrifying day like the one we were having now. As his platoon moved into the rest area, Walter turned and faced his men. "All right, fall in, men," he commanded in his deep voice. He almost sang his words in a monotone, with a throatiness you hear in western Pennsylvania, around Pittsburgh. He was expecting his men to assemble in ranks before giving them permission to fall out and rest. Nobody moved. "My command was fall in, men," Walter intoned. "Doesn't anybody here understand English?" Bullets continued to fly in our vicinity. Corporal Morris, one of his squad leaders, piped in, "Sergeant, you know, it's pretty dangerous falling in here." "Corporal Morris, you heard my command." So there they stood in platoon formation until Walter got his present or accounted for report. "Okay, fall out, men," Walter said in his bass voice, "but remain in the immediate vicinity." "Okay, Chum," somebody in his platoon replied. "Do not call me Chum," Walter intoned. "We cannot be chums now. We're no longer on the line, and my name is Platoon Sergeant Sinsek." "Yes, Sergeant!" I was lying on the ground watching the charade, and by now I was breaking up with laughter. At one moment we'd be scared shitless, and the next moment we'd be laughing. I knew Walter too well to take him seriously. His men fell out, and he came over and sat down next to me. "God damn. I don't know how much more of this I can take, or—" he rumbled in his deep voice. "Walter," I said, "I've had it up to here myself." We'd all had more than we needed or wanted, but we were still alive, and though we didn't realize it, the worst was nearly over for us. Back in late October, our operation planners had decided to set up a delay defense position at the south end of the MLR. L Company was elected. We were moved to a ridge about 100 yards forward of our MLR in the direction of Mount Austin. This wasn't an extension of the MLR. It was a forward outpost leaving roughly a 75-yard gap in the MLR and placing 3 undermanned platoons alone on this new ridge. The purpose seems to have been to surprise, disrupt, or delay any assault that the enemy might attempt from the Matanikau direction. In other words, in the event of an attack, L Company was supposed to give them hell and then be hung out to dry. Before going out there, we'd been told that we were to dig in and hold our position to the last man. The question nobody ever answered for us was, then what? Who the hell does the last man report to? This was a hush-hush move, and we found that out the hard way. As we had dug in at our new positions, one of our own planes flew overhead, took a good look, moved away, decided we must be Japanese, then came back and dropped a bomb on us. Luckily it missed. The Japanese found out about us anyhow. It didn't take them more than a day to discover what we were doing, because their daily flight of Zeros would zoom in and strafe us. We dug in and fortified our positions, took turns making patrols in every direction, and settled down to a monotonous routine, the high point of which consisted of our 2 tablespoons of Japanese rice seasoned with maggots, served twice a day, day after day. If we wanted water, we went back behind our lines and got it for ourselves. No American ships or airplanes came in, and we were positioned on high ground that gave us a good view of sea, sky, and any airplane soon before it landed, or just after it took off from our airfield. The only friendly planes we ever saw were 2 or maybe 3 patched-together Ep.4 F Wildcats that at any one time were able to take off and have a go against the Japanese bombers and fighters that visited the canal regularly. This routine went on for quite a while. We were back on our outpost one night in mid-November. I was temporarily top man in L Company's 1st platoon, with both the platoon sergeant and Lieutenant Flaherty still in the field hospital with malaria. Checking back into the pages of official battle histories, it turns out that the night I'm talking about was Friday, November 13th. But I'm sure none of us knew the date at the time, or even that it was a Friday. Nor did we know we had purchased ringside seats, the best seats in the house, for one of the Guadalcanal campaign's biggest and deadliest sea battles. There were 2 platoons, maybe 30 of us holding our positions, sitting out in the open in total darkness on the coral ridge within easy daytime view of the bay that spread out before us. Our line of sight took us over the top of a grove of tall coconut trees that separated us from the beach roughly 200 yards away. But it was night, and all we saw was black. We knew the Japanese came right in with their ships at night. You could smell them, smell the different food aromas from the ships, and you could feel the heat and smell the fuel up on the ridge. The Japanese would come in after dark, but they wouldn't fight. There usually wasn't anything out there to fight, but it was different on this night. By now we knew the Japanese were out there again, and we were just sitting around on the ground out in the open. We had no reason to be afraid. It was good and dark. Then, maybe about 10 o'clock, all of a sudden the Japanese spotlights burst on and biff, bam, bam. In quick succession, they started blasting away at some target at sea. An echo from a blast of a big cannon rolled up the ridge. "Damn, catch a load of that one," someone said. And then our navy started in. We didn't know any of our navy's ships were out there, or even that they were anywhere near the canal. What we did know was that the Japanese weren't shooting at nothing. We knew they weren't shooting at us, and we knew somebody, it had to be our guys, was giving it right back to them. In a typical night battle, our navy would wait for the enemy to cross the T, whatever the hell that means. But the Japanese would throw on these big spotlights. And then they'd both start blasting away. Between the flashes and the booms lighting up the pitch blackness of the night sky, it was like an old-fashioned knockdown drag-out street fight. What a show, with a flash breaking the darkness and just briefly lighting up shadows in the bay. Then a quick blaze of fire and another flash from the other side, and another boom, then a flash over there to the left, then the echo of a bang, like the end of the fireworks display on the 4th of July. As we watched the flashes and ricochets light up the night and heard the artillery booms and bangs between the flashes of light, someone said, "God damn, we're kicking the crap out of those Shambos." Shambo was one of the less polite names our guys called the Japanese. From our vantage point, we didn't know who was doing what. The Marine who made that comment was being optimistic. "Yeah," someone else said, "I hope we are." On that night, we had a field phone hookup with our company command post, located back at the MLR. Somebody from CP got on the line and gave us the scoop that our cruiser task force was kicking hell out of the Japanese Navy. But the truth is that everybody on shore was guessing and hoping. In fact, both the American and Japanese navies suffered heavy losses during that night's battle. Though tactically it was a stalemate, strategically it was an American victory, because it prevented the landing of a large Japanese ground force on the island. All the time, the flashes and booms continued to crack the darkness. But as hard as you strained your senses, you couldn't see what was taking place right before your eyes. You might see the reflection of water or the shadows of steel forms in the dark right after a sharp blast, but you couldn't put details on the shadows. I'd estimate the battle raged for 30 to 45 minutes that night, first close into the beach and then farther out. Even when the spotlights came on, you couldn't see much. The firing would start. Everything was flashbang over here and boom over there, off and on, back and forth. All you knew was that a lot of hitting was going on. We were probably a quarter mile from the action at one point. You could smell the powder from there. We just sat there tense on the ridge, not really understanding that one of the war's major naval battles was spread out before our eyes. There were no cheers, no shouts. Now and then someone said, "God damn!" after a bright flash followed by the sound rolling up over the ridge. What happens when you're fighting in those circumstances is that all your senses are heightened, a natural reaction in order to stay alive. Your smell, your hearing, your sight, your peripheral vision. You hear a little sound. "Oh, that's a land crab," you say to yourself, and you ignore it. You even recognize each other by smell. We didn't bathe, we all stank. You got to know the guy in the darkness by his particular odour. So we watched as the action seemed to move away from the beach and then subside, and then we smelled the battle in the darkness. Our platoon's only form of communication with the outside world that night was a field phone operated by a young kid named Billy Edwards. At about the time the tropical dawn began lighting the sky, Edwards woke me up with the report that last night's sea battle hadn't gone too well for our side. I looked out to the bay, and close to shore I made out what appeared to be a heavy cruiser that had been hit pretty badly. Edwards told me he'd received word that it was the USS Atlanta. That rang a familiar bell. One of my childhood buddies, a kid I grew up with back in Buffalo by the name of Roger Pigeon, was a gun turret man on the Atlanta. What I could see of the ship didn't look good. The forward deck no longer appeared to have any gun turrets. I asked Edwards what else he'd been able to find out, and he told me the Atlanta was being scuttled because she was dead in the water. He repeated to me what he'd gotten on the field phone. Her crew has abandoned ship, and most of them are now on the beach. Others from the Atlanta made it to Tulagi. Survivors from some of our other sunken ships are on the beach too. What we all learned later is that during the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese Navy had introduced a new gimmick to night sea battles, while our Navy champions were still fighting sea battles the old way, which the textbooks called crossing the T. The new Japanese way worked better. Taking advantage of the night's darkness, they would steam in close, pick out one or two of our ships, turn their big bright spotlights on them, and open up with everything they had. They were giving us you-know-what from where, while our master tacticians were still looking for some way to cross that T in the middle of those pitch-dark tropical nights. The US Navy was learning the hard way. That morning, looking out through the mist, we made out another wounded cruiser that appeared to be under tow by a destroyer. A couple more of our destroyers were limping, smoke coming out of them from below decks. I saw still another cruiser smoking, I'm guessing it was the Chicago, with a good part of her fantail missing. Looking down at Iron Bottom Sound from our ridge was like looking down at a battlefield after the battle was over, except that our badly wounded weren't only men, but also the ships they manned. I wondered what had become of my old neighbour and childhood buddy, Roger Pigeon. I told Edwards to get company on the phone, and then I took the phone and spoke to my good friend Ben Selvitel, the first sergeant. He turned me over to the company exec officer, Lieutenant Tom Guffin. I asked for permission to leave the ridge for a couple hours. I wanted to check out the beach and look for Roger Pigeon. Since I was temporarily the senior man in L Company's first platoon, Guffin was understandably hesitant about letting me leave the platoon. Finally he gave permission, provided that I get my scroungy body back up on our ridge no later than noon. That was fair enough. In no time at all, I was ready to go down to the beach, my utility uniform torn and filthy, my face showing a couple weeks' growth of beard, my last haircut dating back from a short time after Christ made corporal. I told Seaplipper Larry Gherkin that I'd be gone until around noon, and that he was to take over until I got back. I had my usual breakfast, which was 3 or 4 gulps of fresh air, and headed off toward the beach. The trek down to the shore took me about 10 minutes, where I found myself in the midst of mayhem. Sailors were sprawled on the sand in groups, probably divisions or sections. I didn't see any wounded, though there had to be quite a few casualties after that ferocious nighttime battle. By now the wounded probably had been moved to the island's field hospital. Looking out over the water, I took in the miserable sight of our ships, many of them close to shore and limping around aimlessly like wounded Marines. The nearest ship, battered and with water almost up to her gunwales, but still standing tall, was what remained of the USS Atlanta. On the beach, in the middle of all the chaos, a pair of naval officers stood side by side, one of them looking at the Atlanta through field glasses. I took the opportunity to walk to the surf's edge, sit down on the beach, and do the nearest thing I could manage to bathing, which was to splash water on my face and hands, then submerge my helmet and collect some water to pour over my head. Starved and filthy, I was in poor shape. I stood up again to my full 5'6", my weight down to about 95 pounds, and I shook the water off my body. I walked directly over to those two immaculately dressed naval officers. Clean-shaven, wearing starched khaki uniforms and cordovan polished shoes, they looked as though someone had carried them ashore. That didn't stop me. I approached them. "Hey guys, is that the Atlanta?" As I was asking my question, I noticed that one of these winners had a small eagle insignia on his left collar, which gave him the rank of US Navy captain. Captain or not, he was standing on my beach, where I'd stood many a watch. Under those circumstances, as far as I was concerned, that insignia of his meant Navy beans. The two officers looked back at me, taking in all my scrounginess, the expressions on their faces giving me the feeling that they were glancing at some mysterious new form of lowlife. To his credit, the officer with the eagle on his collar decided to be civil. "Yes, that's the Atlanta," he said. "If you want to take a good last look, you can use these glasses." He started to remove the strap from behind his neck, which I admit was a neighbourly gesture, especially coming from a Navy captain. "No thanks," I said. "I can see her fine, as close to shore as she is. I came down to the beach to try to find an old buddy and neighbour of mine. His name is Roger Pigeon. Either of you guys know the name?" No, they didn't recognize the name, but one of them volunteered. "You might ask some of the men on the beach. Somebody might know him or know his whereabouts." I thanked them and walked away. I didn't have to go more than about 10 paces before I was with a group of sailors sitting on the sand. Every one of them was covered with oil and grease, and they'd clearly had a rough night of it. I asked around, but none of them knew Roger. Just about then, I remembered a simple fact of life on Guadalcanal that the pair of beautifully dressed officers should have known, but apparently didn't. The captain had been civil to me, so maybe I owed him something in return. Also, those poor, beaten-up, grease and oil-smeared sailors had already taken more than their share of punishment, so maybe it was time to do them a good turn. I walked back toward the officers and got their attention. "In case you haven't heard about it, every day, just like clockwork between 11 a.m. and noon, we get an air raid. It might be a good idea to get these guys off the beach, because if those airplanes come in on time today, you're going to have some nervous sailors on your hands." They didn't say thank you, but I have a feeling that they appreciated my advice. I left them and walked along the beach as far as Kukum, asking each group of stranded sailors if anybody knew Roger Pigeon from the Atlanta. All the answers came back negative. By noon, I was back where I belonged, on the ridge and with my warriors. The Atlanta went down and out at about that time. It wasn't until after the war was over that I learned about Roger. He survived. With other shipmates, he'd been picked up earlier that day and taken to Tulagi. We did have the usual air raid that morning. The Japanese planes came over before noon, as I'd predicted. I hope those two Navy champions took my advice and got their sailors off the beach. I guess you can't blame the Navy Department for putting the best face on the story of a ferocious naval engagement, in which both the Americans and Japanese suffered terrific losses of both lives and ships. The story that my folks back home read in the November 17th Buffalo Evening News says little about our own losses at sea, but plenty about sunken Japanese ships. As it turned out, the November 13th sea battle was a strategic victory for our Navy, but it sure didn't look like victory for those of us who saw its aftermath, looking out to sea from our Guadalcanal beaches. The bottom headline got the facts precisely backward. It turned out that in the darkness and general confusion, it was our own ships that fired at each other. But what the hell? Our Navy's victory was messy, and the margin of victory was narrow, but it was a victory. The Japanese fared much worse. For several weeks during November, my platoon was dug in on that outpost on the high ridge about 100 yards out in front of our MLR. During our first days out there, a small patrol brought our food ration out to us once a day. After a week or so, an entire day might pass without that food patrol, which meant nothing to eat. Drinking water was also scarce, and water for sanitation was no more than a distant dream. It was hot, miserable, and isolated up on that ridge. As the weeks passed, we started to reach that stage where warriors stop caring about very much of anything. We were growing lethargic, which is one of the worst things that can happen to any man in combat. Normally, once a warrior reaches the I don't care stage, he is just one small step away from having his dog tags separated and a telegram sent home to his next of kin. One morning on that ridge, we were paid an unexpected visit by a platoon-size patrol led by a full-bird colonel. I happened to be lying in the shade when that colonel strode into our area. He was beautifully attired in pressed riding breeches and shined boots. His hair was trimmed in a neat brush cut, and he looked ready to go out on a parade ground. "Who's in charge here?" he asked. "I am, sir," I said. The man strutted around among our reclining figures, sniffing the bad aromas our bodies were giving off and looking at us with disgust. As I saw it, the colonel had made one mistake by coming out here. Now he made his second mistake by asking me a direct question. "When was the last time you men washed yourselves?" Before I could answer, our little 17-year-old runner, who did double duty as our telephone man, burst out, "Why don't you ask us another stupid question? Why don't you ask us when was the last time we had water to drink?" I think his anger surprised everybody on the scene, including the colonel, but his outburst was justified by our situation.